Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, then I'll just close out.
Okay. So then let's see. I can do with this.
It's a worth doing thing.
All
There.
right. Well, thank you everybody for coming to our second philosophy cafe of this semester. We try to do several of these in a given semester. For a while we did once a month, and then we kind of changed it up a little bit. So thank you for coming. If you're online, thank you very much for attending, Jackson. We appreciate it. Appreciate your time. So Dr. Clark Sexton is in the computer science department, has a great deal of philosophy background. And as he was mentioning earlier, kind of in our pre-talk, there's a real strong connection right in the areas of logic and philosophy, right, and symbolic logic and logic in the context of computer science. So Dr. Sexton is going to talk today about the liar paradox. He's going to look at several possible solutions and then sort of give his own proposed solution to it. So, and I think I said this earlier, but there's little cheese boards that should be out and coming around. Obviously, please feel free to grab some food and hang out here if you want. The way that we usually have these philosophy cafes, how they function, is we have our disciplinary expert will kind of give a talk. And so that'll take, anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes, somewhere around there. Then we'll just open up the entire rest of the time to conversation and discussion. And then when everybody is done conversing and discussing, we're done for the night. So thank you all for coming. My name is Rob Beyer. I teach here at the philosophy department. And I think this is going to be fun. So thank you very much. And with no further talking by me, Clark, Dr. Sexton, please take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Rob.
Yep.
And I'm going to get. You're really important when you have two phones. No, it's because AT&T has terrible service here. Let's see, this is being recorded, right? AT&T has terrible service in Hayes, Kansas. And so I had to get another phone, and they can't port to the 913 phone number. So now I didn't want to give this up because I've given your phone is connected to so many things. So anyhow, but I wanted to mute them both. Okay. So let's get going because there's a lot of material to cover here. I hope you'll find this interesting. Feel free to interrupt, especially with clarification type questions as we're going through, because if something's not clear, well, we need to address it probably about right then. Otherwise, we'll go past it and you'll not understand. Okay, so this is going to be trimmed down, and that's a challenge for me. But the significance of we'll start with this. As you follow along with your handouts, the significance of the liar paradox. Why do we care? That's usually one of the things you write a philosophy paper. It's like, well, say, why does anyone care about this? Why should we publish this or whatever? Well, why should you be here? Why should you listen? Well, it at least appears to threaten our concept of truth. And for philosophers, that's a serious threat. And a lot of philosophers do think that. And some have gone very far because they think it threatens our concept of truth. Also, there's no generally accepted solution to it. Well, that leaves us in a state of peril. Go on a Monty Python tangent there, but I will not. So there are severe consequences of the lack of a solution. It's prompted some philosophers to claim that we need to reject classical logic. And that, this idea that, Aristotle basically laid things out, or at least codified logic. And it's like, okay, propositions are either true or false. Well, now we've got something that seems to suggest, no, something's both, neither. What? Okay. And we'll see exactly why it might lead somebody down that path. And they'll even say they have to accept contradictions. I think the most extreme person I know of this, and I met him personally, actually, in New York City, was Graham Priest. And dialethism is what it knows, but you don't need to know all those fancy words. It's just the idea that, something can be both true and false. And that's jarring to many people, because I thought that was the whole point. If you're arguing with someone and you show that their claim is false, you figure your work is done. They go, no, it's both true and false, and go merrily on their way. That kind of really would upend a lot of the point of a lot of conversations, it seems to me. But regardless, it's a very serious threat. Others think the liar paradox and other so-called semantic paradoxes, because there's a whole range of these, are evidence that the prevailing theory of truth is inadequate. So we got to do some serious reworking of that. Well, without any more about that, why this is worth your time, the liar paradox is often just put as straightforwardly as this. And we'll refer to this as the liar sentence. And it's just the sentence that's in bold there. This sentence is false. Imagine I had a board and I could write on there just this sentence is false. That's the liar sentence. Well, why is that a problem? Well, because people believe you can derive a contradiction from it. And you can derive a contradiction with nothing other than things that seem pretty solid. Or it would appear that this sentence must be either true or false. Isn't that what we just said? Everything has to be either true or false. Okay. Well, so it's either true or false. Well, okay, so we'll take that. But if it's true, then a sentence is true if what it says is true. So it seems like a pretty safe principle too. Then since it says that it's false, it's also false. If it's true, it's false. Well, then it's both true and false, and that's a contradiction. Not good. Well, okay, let's try the only other option available. It's false. Okay, but if it's false, then since, again, that's what it says. It says it's false. Well, it would seem to be true that it's false. And thus it's both false and true. Doesn't matter which order you put true and false and true, still a contradiction. Hence, we have a paradox in that whether the sentence is true or false, it seems like it's got to be one of those two, then you get a contradiction by following pretty unarguable principles of logic. We deduced a contradiction from this one claim, this one sentence, taking it as either true or false. Again, that seems to be truth of logic, or at least classical logic. P or not P, we might say, right? If P is a way of putting the claim made by the sentence. Okay, so that's it. And I could go, there's a storied tradition. This thing is 2,500 years old. Slightly different forms. You have heard all the Cretan, the Cretans say that all Cretans are liars. Version of this, right? Okay. Is the Cretan lying when he says that all Cretans are liars? Is he himself as a Cretan? But we've got versions that other philosophers have noted, and this is just a nice, clean, this sentence is false. You don't have to introduce this concept of lying. That's not the heart of it. Okay? And we'll see there's lots of clever variations of this, but I want to start with the basic one, the liar sentence. This sentence is false. Now, I'm going to walk you through a series of steps. I think we can solve, or as I call it by my title, dissolve. I don't really think I give you a solution to paradox. I'm going to say there is no paradox to begin with. We were mistaken. So it's a dissolution of a problem. When you see it and understand it clearly, you see there was no paradox to begin with. The liar sentence is neither true nor false. Okay, this seems to be the best option. Well, because we started with it, the whole problem was we said, well, it's either true or false. Well, deny that. It's not either true or false. Neither true nor false. Because look, if it was true, we got a problem, we got a contradiction. If it's false, a contradiction. So neither one of those two. Okay, that's good. We're done. Well, while claiming that the liar sentence is neither true nor false would prevent the liar paradox, it would block that derivation because you need that claim. It's either true or false. If you reject that, your proof won't go through. The proof that led to the contradiction. But that doesn't provide a sufficient reason for declaring. I mean, imagine every time you run into a problem, just say, well, I'm going to reject the thing that leads to that problem with no good reason for doing so. There's a nice Latin phrase for that in philosophy. We'd say it'd be ad hoc. We've got some philosophers here. I'm going to draw on you. Okay, who's willing to say, what do we mean by ad hoc? Anybody?
Well, yeah, it seems like ad hoc, it could be, or it could be ad hoc is in everybody's eyes. We use that.
In law? Okay, sure. So I've always had it cast this way, and this goes to the person who taught me logic 40 some years ago at this very university. Tailored to the specific case. That the only reason you're accepting is because it solves the problem you have. If there's no independent reason to accept it. And there's a nice, clever example that.
Did he tell you the one of them slow?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I had this thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I'll tell you. Okay. So this is Pete's dad, Steve Crammell. And one of his gifts as a teacher was that not only could he get the concept across in so many different ways, but he would always have a really good example. And so we had a philosophical example one where, you've got the atomists, and it's really ingenious if you think about it. This may be worth this tangent, okay? So they were thinking that Democritus, I believe it was saying that, well, how did the universe get going? How did we get dogs and cats and rats and bats and elephants and all of those things we have around us? Well, he thought there was really kind of not earth, air, wind and fire, 4 elements. There was some special stuff that everything was made of. All those things, but it was just organized differently. Now, that's kind of close to atoms, molecules. They didn't have any of they couldn't see any of this, but he hypothesized it. pretty good science for armchair philosophy, I'd say. And so, well, how to get going? And even imagine that there were hooks and eyes. I thought you could like the thing, Christmas ornaments, you know, the thing you hook on something coming, and they could get in a chain. Because if you ever had those in a bag, well, they do. They get hooked together in all kinds of nasty ways and get them all entangled, right? Okay, so you got these hooks and eyes, and then a certain combination, and that's a cat. Another combination is a glass of water. Okay.
Early theory of chemical bonding.
Yes, it is.
Instead of electrons, it's not.
Yes, it is the analog for that. So it's really amazing how, in a way, they're on the right track with none of this. So it's like, if you're going to guess, that's a good guess. Okay, so then, well, how to get started? Okay, so he's got an origin story. Because like, well, things didn't just come like this. Everything was just falling. All these things, independent atoms, were just falling throughout time, all in the same direction at a uniform speed. And then somebody pointed out, well, how did they ever bump in? You know, he said, and they bumped into each other, and then you got all these combinations. Well, they'd never bump into each other. Think of this. Imagine traffic going in one direction. They're all going the same speed. Nobody's going to catch up to anybody. Nobody's going to go on a different path. They're not going to intersect. So he had to say, one of them swerved. That's ad hoc. Okay. So it was only to save his theory from this embarrassment. And that's what this would be. Well, I don't like that there's contradictions. So I'm going to ad hoc say, it's neither true nor false. There you go. You happy? No, because you don't feel like I gave you an adequate explanation. And that's what we're on the hunt for now. Because a lot of philosophers have had this idea. Well, it's neither true nor false. I would wager that the average individual, when they first encountered this, and they presented it to students sometimes, and they go, something wrong with that. That intuition, it's like, yeah, I think you're right. Something is wrong here. But you got to go farther than that, do the philosophical work. Okay. So we need, as I say, to also provide an account of why the liar sentence is neither true nor false. And like Democritus, well, why did it swerve would have been a good thing to say. Okay. So the liar sentence, I'd say, well, I'm taking through steps. The first step is, well, it's neither true nor false because it fails to express a proposition. And I'm going to pause here because this is right here is a place where really good philosophers make, I think, a terrible mistake. Because they think of neither true nor false as another truth value. There's true, false, and neither true nor false. I even saw Jeffrey Kaplan in a nice YouTube video explaining the liar paradox. I rewatched it again just early this evening, refresh my memory. And he draws a circle and he puts true, false, and that's how you carved it up initially. Well, neither true nor false, and he puts it in the same circle. And you go, oh, that's not right. It's not a truth value. Neither true nor false is, it doesn't have a truth value. And that's going to be key from my account. Because the way in which it fails to have a truth value is it fails to express a proposition. And go back to, it's only here's one of the things I will say again and again. Only propositions are true or false. We really get ourselves in a lot of trouble when we get lazy and say sentences are true or false. And I'll give you a really good argument for saying, no, not all sentences are true or false. That's the problem. This was a sentence. We shouldn't even say, I mean, I really think if we were more rigorous, we'd never say things like this sentence is false. It's like a category mistake almost to me. What? We'll get to that.
Could you, just really quickly, Clark, could you explain like what a proposition is and how we might distinguish a proposition from a sentence
Right.
for people that don't maybe have a background in that?
Yes. Okay. Here's the way I've heard some better minds. Nathan Solomon actually has a nice explanation of this. He and Scott Soames in an early book that they co-authored. And was, well, the proposition is what is expressed, what is in common. Most of us have an intuitive idea of a proposition. It's the thing that a declarative sentence expresses. What is it? Is the bearer of truth values. That's a philosopher's sort of account. Well, think of it this way. Translate something into a foreign language. In Hayes, can I count on someone knowing a little German? Der Schnee ist weiß. Snow is white. Okay, but now, do those say the same thing? Roughly? Okay. So, and they had, what is it?
La Nieve es Blanca?
Yes,
Say that?
right. Yeah, they actually did it in French. And I said, well, I figured in this town, more people would know some German, right? Okay, but we think that there is something, there's correct translation, right? Well, what are you getting right? That when they what? When the sentence in English and the sentence in German says what? The same thing. That same thing, that's the proposition. Now, that's not always true because the same thing they express might be something non-propositional. It could be a question, you know. Voas debatism is neither true nor false, but we could translate it.
Right, or figures of speech, like
Sure.
there's different figures of speech that could be.
Right.
different.
But now getting back to the declarative sentences that we translate from one language to another, I'm going to say we got to qualify it a lot more than that. By the time you get down to it, the kinds of sentences that are, if somebody tries to get sentences to do the work of propositions, I'd say, well, they end up saying the ones that express propositions. But I will give you this take. My own view is that propositions are abstract entities the way numbers are. We have numerals, things you can write down and you point to it. I actually gave a talk where I said, use this as a category mistake. The square root of 3 is red. Again, borrowing from Steve, because that was an example he liked to use. So square root of 3 is red. And I had somebody who drew it out in red ink on a piece of paper and thought that showed that was mistaken. Of course, that's ridiculous. It's like, yeah, now we have to just get clear about the difference between numerals and numbers. The representation of something, like the physical symbol we use, isn't what we're talking about. And again, we can do that in different languages. The Roman numeral, 2, say, I'm not going to do a square root of 3 in Roman numerals, by the way. But if you had the number 2, right, 2, we think that means the same thing. It represents the what? And I'm going to say the same abstract entity. I don't think you can get by. I think we are ontologically committed to this realm of abstract entities, and propositions are one of them. And they do all kinds of work for us, so we're justified in accepting them because they do real philosophical work. When you don't have them in your ontology, you run into all kinds of puzzles, and one of them is this one, actually. In fact, I would say my account of the liar paradox is one argument for propositions as distinct from sentences. Okay, so hopefully that's enough of a distinction for what a proposition is. Okay, it's the thing that's either true or false expressed by some declarative sentences. Okay, so I'm saying that the liar sentence, this sentence is false, doesn't express a proposition. But now we got to explain, why doesn't it? Because a lot of people look at it as, well, I think I understand it, right? It's not like some of these other things I could give you examples of. There are a lot of sentences that don't express propositions. And I'm saying this is one, okay? But it's not the same way that they fail. Like if I say, shut the door, that's a sentence. You understand it. And I'd say there's nothing really wrong with it. Maybe it's a little rude. Please shut the door, if you would. Okay, might be a little better, but still, it doesn't express a proposition. In fact, it'd be odd for you to say, well, that's true after I said shut the door. If I say, what time is it? Is that false? No, it doesn't express a proposition either. So first of all, one of the things that's easy to show, not all sentences express propositions. So not all sentences are true or false. So this idea that every sentence must be true or false, no, that's a non-starter. Ridiculous. Philosophers say things like that, though. And then you go, yeah, but, and then they go, oh, those are trivial. No, they're not really. By the time you get through them, you end up having to say something like, by the time you separate out all the sentences that don't express propositions, you're getting to basically everything that's proposition in all but name. Quine's eternal sentences come to mind for people who know Quine and dislike him as much as I do. So anyway, but we have other things. I gave examples of what I'd call category mistakes that also, they're declarative sentences that might look okay. So the building is angry. The baseball game is tired. I'd say those are declarative in form, but they don't express propositions. My account of them, at least. I would argue they don't. But that isn't what this is either. This doesn't seem to be a category mistake. Sentences seem to be the kind of thing to be true or false. So I'll ask you to keep that in mind. Is that really the case? Sentences are the kinds of things to be true or false? I'd argue there's a really and very important sense which no, they're not. And sentence we'll see is systematically ambiguous in the way people use it. Okay, so got to explain why it fails a proposition. And those other accounts, let us at least get past the idea that every sentence is must. Okay, so I'm priming people as I wrote this paper out at one point. The key to explaining why the liar sentence fails to express a proposition lies in the occurrence of the expression this sentence. Okay, got that in quotes. That's a referring expression. What's it refer to? In order to interpret the expression, this sentence, and we do have to interpret it, I've got to give some meaning to it. What's the meaning of this sentence? Because if I'm going to say it's true or false, it's got to be the kind of thing that is truth evaluable. Got to interpret it semantically. So as it occurs in the liar sentence, we must semantically interpret the sentence to which it refers. That is the liar sentence itself. But this sentence also includes the expression. So we're end up with this sentence is false. What's this sentence refer to? Well, it refers to the sentence, this sentence is false. So plug that in for this sentence. And you get this sentence is false. And now we're off to the races and it will never end. That's the gist of understanding why this doesn't express a proposition, because it is, as I call it, that ugly phrase, so no one else will steal it, right? A non-terminating semantic component. And the expression, this sentence, we never get a semantic value for it because it keeps trying to, it's like a function call that calls itself to get a value, then has to call itself to get a value, etc. And I can mirror this in programming languages. In fact, I say the same thing is going on because there's a very good case for saying sentences are functions as they're used in natural languages. They're functions. If they're declarative sentences, they're intended to convey truth. They're Boolean functions. That's something that's going to return a value that's either true or false. So you call this function, it returns a value. That's what a function does. We have other kinds of functions, ones that return a number, say, and I'll give you examples of those here in just a bit. But the sentence includes expression in this sentence, and it must be semantically interpreted. And so we must semantically interpret the sentence to which it refers, which is itself, and it just continues infinitely. Process of semantic interpretation can never end. It never gets grounded, is a way we might refer to this. The buck never stops. So this feature, the non-termination of a semantic component of the sentence, is the key to explaining why the liar sentence fails to express a proposition. Oh, wait, 2 people in the waiting room. This is bad. I had people here I need to let in. Admit. My apologies. I don't know why. I'm gonna blame you.
You're good. You're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that, Dave. I should have admitted you some time ago. Okay. So this feature, the non-termination of the semantic component. Now I need to get this out of the way.
I have a question. on it.
Sure.
Oh, it's not really a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, comment.
It's really a comment. It's like, okay, someone just left the room and I would like to say, I love you. And I'm saying to that man right over there.
Okay.
So how does that, what kind of,
I may,
What kind of
I may
function
call
is
it
it?
a liar, or I may
Yeah,
call you
yeah.
a liar?
yeah. Yeah, no,
Oh,
That's
now
not-
the best I can make out of what you're asking, tell me if I'm right,
I mean,
is that when he left the room, you say it and there's nobody there to refer to. Is that it?
what's that?
Is that a failure of reference you have in mind? I love you and there's an empty chair? When he was gone, you said, I love you?
Oh, no, he walked through the door.
Oh,
and
well,
it's-
then I guess I'm not seeing how that's related to this claim.
It's not a lie.
It's not a lie,
True.
it's true.
Okay,
Correct.
So,
right, but there's no paradox. Nobody would find that.
I hope nobody would find that.
Well, maybe I don't know your relation to this individual.
That's great.
Maybe that's so absurd. It's like, you might not be inherently unlovable. No, sorry, I don't know.
Holy crap, why did you just bring me into something?
Right.
yeah, but no, this is a great table. So, no,
So
that's,
I think that
Okay.
I would guess, and I don't want, I guess I don't want to speak for Clark, but I would think that like a lot of expressions you can evaluate truth, like as whether it's true or false.
yes,
And so for that one, we might just check what is your relationship and what is your emotional state between love and emotion.
You have
All
some
that is
long-term
related.
commitment involved here. Maybe that's what love really is. Instead of some momentary feeling, it's like, nah, I don't like him some days, but I do love this person. I'll have their back. I mean, that's what marriage is really built on, that kind of love. You don't have to have warm, fuzzy feelings all the time.
So to determine whether it's true, we could just check facts about you and him and your relationship and your attitude. And then if those things are the case and that would be true, then we're kind of done. But if in the liar sentence, when it's this sentence is false, the thing referred to is the sentence itself. So it's like it's hard to get conditions outside of whatever that is, determine whether it's true or false, which is probably why it's a big paradox.
yeah, and it's very wonderful if anybody in the room here, especially him,
Yeah.
knows that I love him.
Yeah,
Right, okay. But I guess I'm,
put forward.
right, okay,
That's why,
okay,
that's what it is.
okay. Well,
Keep going, bud.
yes. Well, okay, so, but if we have this idea that there's the non-terminating semantic component, you get no semantic value. It's not like there's some default value you plug in there. And I'll give you an analogy for this one in a little bit here too, with a programming language. And if I'm right, then we now have an explanation. So it's no longer ad hoc to say why the liar sentence fails to express a proposition. We have good reason to claim because it never terminates. We need to have a semantic value for a component of the overall structured proposition, and there's just a hole in there. Never gets filled.
I guess I'm not quite sure how this is, so in order to interpret the expression, so this sentence, that occurs, you must semantically interpret the sentence to interpret something with a demonstrative. Wouldn't the interpretation just involve assigning a reference, and that would be about all we have to do? I guess
Okay, now, if you think it's just, okay, this sort of gets ahead of things here. But if you think you're just pointing to it, what kind of thing can be pointed to? Not a semantic interpretation, a string of characters you can point to. And that's the ambiguity of this sentence. And that's why something like this sentence is short is not the kind, not a counter to this
You
point.
wouldn't even be able to assign a reference. To the
Right.
document.
Maybe when I get the function in JavaScript, which you don't have to understand it too much. I'll go walk through it. But most of you, maybe if you had a little math, you get this idea of a factorial function. I did in a programming language and actually coded it in here to show that it has the same problem. Okay, well, if I'm right, since we now have you've got a good reason.
Somebody's, I'm sure.
Okay,
Margarita, no chicken.
so now I want to give you this analogy. The same problem of a non-terminating semantic component occurs in functions with no base clause. So in math, when you have like the factorial function, you want it's got to end somewhere or start somewhere, you might say. You could say, well, we just decided that factorial, let's take a poll. What is factorial of 1? What's the value of factorial 1? 1, yes. Right, yes, that's the exclamation point. Right, there you go, yes, and it's 1. And you don't have to call factorial again. Factorial of 1 is just 1. Now, numbers larger than 1, they have to say, well, we'll decide that by taking the number that you sent me, like factorial of 2 is 2 times the factorial of 2 minus 1, which is 1. And in general, the factorial of n, any number other than 1, or you could do 0, and then we don't worry about negative numbers for the most part, but it's like we're just using non-negative numbers here. For anything higher than that, it's going to be, so the factorial of 4 is going to be 4 times the factorial of 1 minus 4, or 4 minus 1. So the factorial of 3, well, that's going to be 3 times factorial of 2. 2 is like factorial of 2 times factorial of 1. And it bottoms out at 1, which is just 1. And now you can put them all back together. 1 times 2 times 3 times 4, 24. 4 times 3 is 12 times 2 is 24. Okay, so yeah, and that works great. But if there is no base clause, if we, as your handout shows, if I take away that if, then else structure, and I just say, well, suppose factorial of n is just, well, I'm going to say it's n times factorial of n minus 1. We're close, but there's no way to stop that. It's going to keep going. It's like the acid that burns through everything. Okay? Because you call that with 4, and it's going to say, okay, I'm going to return as a value for this function call 4 times factorial of 3. Well, I got to call factorial to get that, right? So what's factorial of 3 going to do? It keeps doing it. And with nothing like the if, yeah, running out of time. My Zoom thing will have to start and stop again here in a bit. Anyway, the recording. But you're just going to have an infinite recursion. Factorial is going to keep calling itself, and the numbers will get. In fact, I did this in a talk one time, and I let it just crash the system because that's what it do. Eventually, the web browser will die because you run out of memory. And it'll never, and it does it return a value? Would we say the factorial, that the second factorial function without a way to stop? What's the value of that? What's the semantic value, you might say? What is the value it returns? What's the numeric value of it? It doesn't have one because it never returns a value, never completes. It's a non-terminating function. So it's the same It's the same basic problem. Okay. Any expression that includes a call to such a function will fail to terminate. So if it was embedded in a larger expression, that would also vitiate it. Okay, since if the whole thing has to have a value and that component doesn't. Okay. Now we can mirror that. Now look down just a little bit more of if we construe sentences as functions, we can write a function in a programming language that represents the lyre sentence. This is also in the JavaScript programming language, for instance, but any programming language can do that same thing. So you have a function called this sentence, deliberately name that. And then you return the value. What's the value of this sentence? The semantic value of it is, well, this sentence is false, because is that double equal sign is a check for equality. So if this sentence has the value, equals the Boolean value false, then well, in order to find that, it's got to call itself. It's got to call this sentence. And that's like the factorial with no base clause where it never ends. So you get the same infinite recursion due to lack of a base case. So I'd say we now have what we need, an explanation of why the lyre sentence fails to express a proposition and why it's neither true nor false. And that's not a truth value, just as the factorial doesn't give us a number. We don't say, oh, factorial without a base clause is 0. And so we have no grounds for saying, say, this sentence, well, because it never returns a value, it's false. No, it has no truth value. And neither true nor false is not a third truth value. It's the absence of a truth value. Now, here's an interesting thing that I've never come across anyone who's noted this, actually. There's a vast literature on this, so I might have missed it. But the same problem occurs in what they call the truth teller. Most people don't see any problem with this sentence as true, but it's got the same problem if I'm right. Because you can't get a value for this sentence out of it either. It keeps calling itself just as much. The equals true equals false actually in a programming language will never get evaluated because it's going to hit that thing on the left side first. It's going to make the call to this sentence and you'll never even get to checking whether it's true or false. You'll just have an infinite set of calls from the function to that function. And then it'll run out of memory and crash your whole computer if you don't have some sandbox to kind of keep things playing nice. So the truth teller also fails to express a proposition. I think that's nice. I think that's what we want. The same explanation of, because does it matter whether we say this thing that doesn't have a value is true or false? No, neither one of them expresses a proposition. Just because, and notice now, we're not saying, well, we rejected it because it leads to a contradiction, because the truth teller, nobody thought it led to a contradiction. This sentence is true. Okay, fine.
So is the problem, I'm not sure necessarily follow, but is the idea that this sentence is doing it?
This sentence is a function call. It's something that must have a semantic interpretation.
So what if I say this sentence is an English?
We'll get to that. You're going to a possible objection section. Okay. Right. No, you're not. No, no, David, you're exactly where you should be. That's exactly the question you should be asking. What am I going to do with that? Because that's where a lot of philosophers, that's where Kripke went wrong. Kripke's passed away in the last couple of years and was considered by many to be one of the greatest living philosophers while he was alive. And I had the good fortune to sit in on some classes of his, and he had a paper where he touched on this problem. And I think he was so dangerously close because he actually used the expression I really like. And we'll use that when we talk about the distinction between that kind of sentence or the one I like to use is this sentence is short. This sentence is written in English would do just as well. Okay. The same problem can occur in sets of sentences. This is one that people like. Well, in fact, Jeffrey Kaplan in his YouTube video says, well, this can't be a problem of self-reference. Now notice I'm not using that phrase self-reference. I say a non-terminating semantic component for a reason. Because, okay, I'll cede that point. Because you can have a sentence that says, as I have here, the next sentence is true. And then that next sentence says the previous sentence is false. Now, again, represent that in a programming language and you get a function where the previous sentence, that function calls the next sentence. And then when it gets a value back, it'll check whether that's true. When, let's say if it gets a value back, because when it calls the next sentence, that one says, oh, for me to give you a value, I got to get the value from this other function. Oh, it's called the previous sentence, so I'll call it. Back and forth they go between each other. Non-terminating semantic component. You never get a value, so you never check whether it's true or check whether it's false. Same infinite recursion vitiates this. And so there's no truth There's nothing that's truth evaluable in that pair of sentences. And it can be put a lot of different ways. The sentence at the top of page 354, philosophers get clever with their examples, right? And then you go to the one on the top of page 54, and maybe it sends you on this merry chase all around. You could have 53 sentences that all were in a big circle like this. And you could say, oh, it's not self-reference. No, but it's cyclical, whatever you want to call this. It's the kind of thing where you have a non-terminating semantic component. That is, you never get a final value back. So you can't tell whether anything's true or false because you don't even know what you've got. You have no semantic value to check for truth or falsehood. Now, what a lot of people are just wedded to is the idea that this obviously has to do with truth. Because it seemed like it only came up because we said is false of the thing. That's what led to the contradiction. The paradox has to have something to do with truth, doesn't it? And I say, no. It's fairly easy to show the problem does not essentially involve the concept of truth, but the same problem occurs in sentences with no truth predicate. For example, the sentence, take the non-terminating command. Do what this sentence commands you to do. What do? You don't know. Because you got to find out what this sentence is commanding you to do to do what the sentence commands you to do. Same problem. And then it's easy to do this in fact, I could have done that in a different, there are some programming languages which are imperative. They have commands in them like that. And you say, yeah, that's the same sort of thing. Not functions that return a value like that. But I use the function here where you turn an integer. That's not true. That's not a truth predicate. It's just, okay, I've got something that's going to get the value of the next function plus 2. And then the next function gets the previous function plus 3. Same infinite loop. In fact, whether we're adding 2 or 3 to it is irrelevant. These are just going to get caught up in the same back and forth like the previous sentence and the next sentence. So they have some sort of cyclical reference. It may be a simple self-referring expression in a single sentence, as in the liar sentence, the truth teller, and the non-terminating command, or maybe in a set of sentences. In fact, Kripke had this really interesting one about Watergate sentences, because he wrote this at the time Nixon was there. And I forget exactly how it goes. It's something like I think Dean was asked, he said, well, everything that Nixon says is a lie or something like that. And Nixon said something about whether Dean was telling the truth, but the details don't matter. You could have things like that. And yes, you could bring in quantifiers. You're gonna, I think, have the same problem and then the same solution. So a lot of people think, oh, well, there's lots of variations on this. I'm going to give you one of them called the strengthened liar. Well, what if we replace, this is what a lot of people go to, you may have a nice explanation for the liar paradox, but there's the strengthened liar, where we replace false with not true. This sentence is not true. Now I ask you, look at the account I've given. Does that matter one bit? No. Because you never even get to checking whether it's not true, because you're still off on your infinite loop of trying to get a semantic value to check whether it's true. Remember, the truth teller ran into the same problem. Whether it's the not true or the false or the true doesn't matter. You're never going to have anything to evaluate. The semantic interpretation never ends. Now let's get to, I think this is the gist of the concern you might have. Okay, here's the possible objection. This is on page 4. But some self-referential sentences are non-problematic. Kripke gives this. There are self-referential sentences that are no way problematic. For example, the short sentence. This sentence is short. That doesn't lead to a paradox. And not only that, unlike the truth teller, it doesn't seem to be a problem. In fact, I can do a function that represents that. Is short, and then the short sentence is just return is short of the sentence. Now notice I put the string of characters. This sentence is short and passed it as a parameter. It takes that string and checks the length of it and says,